What you're about to see is a rare window into the Eastern Orthodox Church, the lies, cover-ups, superstition, and science denial of a branch of Christianity boasting 230 million members. A tragic window into a system-wide scandal resulting in the mass death of its congregants. If you're religious and you're watching this, I want to make one thing abundantly clear. I don't want to make this video. And in an ideal world, I wouldn't have to. I have no personal beef with the Eastern Orthodox Church. In fact, I've personally visited many churches like the ones mentioned in this video, and for the most part, have very fond memories of my time. The gorgeous architecture, the angelic sound of bells mixing with the melody of monks singing, the rich history, and the friendly people all come to mind. I've had Orthodox professors, friends, and roommates who I respect and cherish. Although I'm not a fan of the religious dogma, I care about the people. So when I see tragedies like this, it fucking shatters me. But while I would rather make humorous content or talk about scientific progress, countless thousands have needlessly lost their lives in the last several months alone, thanks to millennia-old practices which put legalistic superstitious customs above the safety of people's lives. Even if this video is but a whisper, drowned out in the sea of internet noise, these needless dead deserve a voice. January 30th, the WHO declares a global health emergency. A novel coronavirus has made its international debut, and with no treatment or vaccine, soon begins ravaging the world, leaving a trail of bodies in its wake.
Hospitals are reaching full capacity. Here the halls and waiting rooms are packed, standing room only, as they wait for someone to treat them.
By mid-February, the virus has made its way to Europe, exploding exponentially.
In another Madrid hospital, patients lie on the floor because there are no beds left.
By March, entire countries are going into lockdown in an effort to save lives and slow the spread of the pandemic, temporarily closing non-essential businesses and forbidding public gatherings. But churches of all denominations resisted. Italy, hammered hard by the virus, urged everyone to stay home, while the Pope encouraged his elderly priests to go out and deliver communion. Hundreds of Catholic priests tested positive for the virus after this, and the Pope faced criticism for keeping Vatican offices open. Protestant churches in the US, refusing to follow shelter-in-place laws, became hotbeds of the disease.
We had a church that had a preacher from Texas come down to Dawson Springs March 15th and 16th for a revival. When he left, multiple families were sick. Church placed a post on social media that those people did not have the corona, they just had the flu. According to several people interviewed, they were encouraged not to self-quarantine and still come to church. Hopkins County now has 24 cases, hundreds of contacts, and 2 deaths with an epidemiological link to this revival.
But the worst offender of all was the Eastern Orthodox Church. Many Orthodox churches remained open all the way through Easter. Some still are, ignoring all laws against public gatherings. And rather than altering practices for the safety of their congregation, members were still allowed to attend services without masks, where they kiss icons and partake of communion using the same spoon. Yes, you heard that right. During a global pandemic lockdown, recipients of the Eucharist were herded to the front of crammed churches to slurp up the sacrament from a shared utensil, graciously endowing the next participant with millions of bacteria and viruses spread across a thin film of spittle. Was this an isolated case? One rogue church ignoring a litany of mandates from the Orthodox hierarchy? Absolutely not. Orthodox churches from Greece to Georgia to Australia, Romania, Russia, and everywhere in between continued to observe communion with the village spoon, arguing even during a pandemic that the practice was safe, a position not shared by most medical experts. Now, they could have listened to the advice of doctors and medical professionals. They could have opted for online services. They could have required masks of all parishioners and roped off the icons people love to kiss. But instead, religious zealots actively protested temporary shelter-in-place requirements, fueled on by the encouragement of priests, who clustered crowds of their own parishioners to the front of the building to share each other's saliva by way of the Grim Reaper's cutlery. When several elderly women at an Orthodox church in Tbilisi, Georgia were asked if they had ever thought about using antiseptic wipes, they dismissed the idea, saying, "My faith is my antiseptic." To make matters worse, some clergy spread conspiracy theories, claiming that the virus itself was a hoax. Others claimed it was targeted persecution and encouraged people to resist. At least one high-ranking bishop claimed that the coronavirus was a scheme of the Antichrist, while another priest stoked fears that it was a satanic plot aided by Jews. Even though this pandemic has affected everyone, every country, every religion, every person, temporary laws against large public gatherings aren't an effort to persecute the church, they're an attempt to save the lives of its members. Hell, even atheist conferences like American Atheist, the Faithless Forum, and Skeptical have all had to postpone events. So did tech conferences and music festivals like South by Southwest. Is that persecution? Church leaders could help us beat this thing. They have influence, they have platforms, and people look to them to lead in difficult times. None of us are thrilled by lockdown procedures. We're all trying to save lives. But instead, church leaders have actively sabotaged efforts to stop this pandemic. Priests and nuns claimed their faith would protect them and their congregants. They claimed that you couldn't spread disease through Holy Communion, and some even claimed that churches themselves were places of healing where you couldn't get sick. And one by one, Orthodox churches around the world became contagion megacenters. Thousands of priests, monks, and nuns fell ill, and many of these churches attempted to hide their infection rates in order to keep congregants coming and to protect the faith. And they came. Infected parishioners flocked to church services. Hoping for healing, they instead infected others. They demanded miracles, but no miracles came. The priests had promised them healing. They had promised their congregation that no one had ever gotten sick from Holy Communion. But now, the emperor had no clothes. This could devastate the faith of anyone willing to peer behind the curtain, but almost no one did, for it would be utterly taboo and even social suicide to question a priest, especially in Orthodox communities where 90% or more of the population are practicing Christians. But before long, this problem was getting bigger than even the most devout believers could ignore. In a formal letter to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Patriarch Kirill, over 40 educated, well-respected, but confused Orthodox Christians wrote the following. Among the bishops and clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church, there are many who do not take seriously the threat of becoming infected with the COVID-19 virus. There are priests who silently ignore your calls for parishioners to stay home, and there are those who openly preach that it is impossible to get infected in the church. Many bishops continue to serve, some directly call people to services. There are bishops who literally force priests to serve in churches even when they're empty. Some priests received information that there was an unspoken order in their dioceses and monasteries to hide information about the real extent of infection among the clergy. There's already talk of dozens of infected clerics in Moscow alone, some in serious condition. And as a terrible admonition, we accepted the news of the death of Archpriest Alexander Agaikin, rector of the Epiphany Cathedral in Olokhov. In almost all large monasteries, men and women are being infected, often most of them. But monasteries are not closed to pilgrims and become centers of mass infection. We believe that daily information on the number of newly infected priests and on how many churches have been closed will help the church as a whole to take our common misfortune seriously and make decisions responsibly. Preservation of medical confidentiality, of course, remains the requirement of the law. However, there are many examples when priests who care about their flock themselves publicly announce their illness. We are confident that such openness can and should become the norm among pastors. In any case, information should be available on which churches and in which monasteries there are sick and infected clerics and inhabitants. The stakes are extremely high. The health and lives of parishioners, of pilgrims and families, often large families, and of the priests themselves. We respectfully ask you for support and hope that such information will be available soon. The completeness of the church needs the truth, even if this truth is bitter and disturbing. One of the most sacred Orthodox holy sites, the Monastery of the Caves in Kiev, Ukraine, ignored lockdown regulations and remained open to outsiders. By the time police eventually arrived to block visitors from entering, it was too late. The contagion had spread to 142 priests and visitors, including the monastery's abbot. And with Orthodox churches holding larger than ever gatherings on Easter weekend, infection rates soared. One bishop even went so far as to say that the pestilence began on Good Friday. And as the lies, deception, and cover-ups spread throughout Christendom, one Belarusian megachurch took the cake, rising above the rest to cement itself as the pinnacle example of how not to act during a pandemic. but it gets its own video. I'll put a link to that video in the description below as soon as it's released. Until then, make sure that you're subscribed and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss it. Unfortunately, many of these important topics are considered taboo to even talk about. For that reason, religious scandals usually don't get the press that they deserve for the harm that they cause. All of you can change that in one simple way. Share this video and others like it on social media to increase the reach of this message. And if you want to go a step further, you can support creators like me on Patreon so that we can keep making videos like this full time, grow our channels, and help keep the world honest. Until next time, thank you so much for your ongoing support. Dare to be curious, and don't drink the Kool-Aid.